The jungle was alive with the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but stalked. Every breath hung heavy, humid, sticky with the taste of rot and gun oil. The dense canopy above, a tangle of gnarled limbs and oversized leaves, blocked out the moonlight in great blotches, casting everything in uneven shadows. Somewhere behind the line, a mosquito whined past a marine's ear, and he flinched, not from the bite, but because he could hear it. Hear anything. Because that's how quiet it was. No birds. No frogs. Not even the rhythmic clicks of insects. Just the hush. A predator's hush. The kind that settles not when something has died, but when something is hunting. "Stay alert, boys," Staff Sergeant Holloway whispered, crouched behind a moss-coated boulder. "Keep an eye on the canopy." "Roger that," came the murmured response from two of the men behind him. Neither moved. Neither blinked. It was 1942. Guadalcanal. The jungle had devoured 1,000 footsteps that night, mud sucked at boots, vines reached like claws from the underbrush. Somewhere far off, artillery had thundered earlier in the day, but here, in the center of the island, the war felt suspended. Like it had held its breath. The squad moved in a staggered file, skirting the edge of a ravine thick with mist. Their orders had been vague: recon the tree line beyond Hill 98, look for evidence of enemy movement, report back. But nothing about this felt like an enemy patrol. The jungle was too still. The air too wrong. Private Eli Summers wiped the sweat from his brow and adjusted the strap of his helmet. He hated the way it pressed down over his ears, made it harder to hear. Right now, sound was everything. You didn't need eyes in a jungle like this. You needed instinct. And his were screaming. Up ahead, Holloway raised a fist. Everyone stopped. No movement. No whisper. Just a dozen pounding hearts and the distant groan of trees shifting under their own weight. "Did you hear that?" whispered Private Ramirez behind Eli. "Hear what?" Eli murmured, already knowing the answer. "Like dragging something heavy." Ellis' hand went instinctively to his rifle. Not because he believed Ramirez, but because he did. The squad continued, slower now, flanking right along the jungle's edge. And then, another sound. A low creak. Not wood. Something wetter. More. Animal. Holloway dropped to a knee. There, just beyond a thicket of elephant grass, was movement. Not the sudden kind. The wrong kind. Too smooth. Too tall. The shape rose from behind a collapsed log, uncoiling into something that didn't make sense. A silhouette so large it didn't seem to belong in the natural world. It stood upright, definitely upright, and yet its proportions were wrong. Shoulders sloped forward like a great ape's. Arms hung past its knees. The head. Too flat. Too wide. Glinting with something that caught what little moonlight filtered through the leaves. Eyes. Eli blinked, heart hammering. It wasn't real. Couldn't be. A trick of shadow. A misfire of nerves. Then it moved. No crash. No roar. Just a blur, dark mass shifting deeper into the trees without a sound. But not away. Around. Circling. Contact front. Holloway hissed. The squad dropped, weapons raised, forming a perimeter. But nothing emerged. Not yet. Time stretched. Every second an hour. Then something slammed into the ground behind them. Hard. Trees shivered. Branches snapped. The men spun, rifles trained, but there was nothing. Just a scattering of leaves. A low, guttural huff. "Jesus Christ," someone muttered. "Shut up," Holloway barked. "Eyes up." The canopy. Ellis' stomach turned. Had seen orangutans once in a magazine, how they hung from trees, limbs too long, muscles packed into unlikely shapes. This thing moved like that. But bigger. Too big. And now the sounds were coming from above. The squad backed toward the ravine, unsure whether to run or hold position. But the truth was, nobody was prepared for this. Not for something that wasn't supposed to exist. Then came the smell. It hit them like a wave, sweet, sour, coppery. Like meat left out in the sun. Eli gagged and pulled his collar over his nose. That's when the screaming started. Not theirs. Ahead, through the dense foliage, a single voice tore through the jungle, sharp, high-pitched, ragged with terror. It cut through the silence like a knife. Yamamoto. It was a Japanese voice. They weren't alone. Another scream followed. Then silence. A silence even deeper than before. As if the jungle itself had gone deaf. The Marines froze. I thought this sector was clear. Ramirez breathed. Holloway didn't answer. They all stood there, staring into the dark, waiting for something. Anything. And then, slowly, from the treetops, it came into view. Not crashing through. Not charging. It descended. A pale arm, long, muscled, veined like a tree root, reached down from the branches and gripped the trunk like it was a toy. Then a second arm. Then a torso. It lowered itself silently, its face still hidden, until only its legs remained in the canopy. It was enormous. Eli couldn't breathe. Then, the eyes. Two faint orange glows. Not bright. Not flashing. But alive. Watching. Studying. It tilted its head. Not like an animal. Like a man. And then, it smiled. Not wide. Just enough. Enough to show teeth. The Marines opened fire. The burst of muzzle flashes lit the jungle like a strobe, bark flying, the thunder of gunfire tearing through the stillness. But the thing was gone before the first casing hit the ground. The treetops rustled. Then silence. Did we hit it? Summers asked. No one answered. Because no one knew. And worse, they all felt it. It hadn't run. It had retreated. On purpose. Measured. Patient. As though it had learned what it needed to. And that's when Holloway spoke, voice low. Keep your eyes up. It's not done. Then, from deeper in the jungle, a sound. Not a scream. Not a howl. A voice. Low. Vibrating. Like a drum buried under the earth. Not language. But something that knew what sound meant to humans. Eli gripped his rifle tighter. Sweat poured down his neck. He realized something then. This wasn't war. This was territory. And they didn't belong here. Not anymore. The Pacific in 1942 was a theater of both strategy and savagery. Not just the clash of empires or the mechanized march of war, but something older. More primal. Somewhere beneath the roar of engines and the bark of orders, a different kind of story was unfolding. One that would never be officially documented, but would echo through generations of whispers and half-forgotten folklore. It begins not with a bang, but with a displacement, of people, of power, and of something long buried in the green hush of the Solomon jungles. Before the war, the Solomon Islands were a remote, subtropical chain in the Coral Sea. To most of the world, they were a footnote in geography textbooks, a dot on the map between New Guinea and Vanuatu. To the locals, they were everything. Land, life, and legacy. Generations had lived and died within the shadow of those thick canopies. The islands were carved with memory, tribal paths, ancient stories, sacred places deep in the mountains that even the boldest hunters refused to tread. And then the war came. At first, the Solomon Islanders only heard of it secondhand. It was a distant thunder, Europe ablaze, Asia rising. But the thunder rolled closer with every passing month. The Japanese, advancing across the Pacific with mechanical precision, claimed island after island, fortifying their perimeter in a bid to hold the Allied forces at bay. In May of 1942, their reach extended to the Solomons. To the Japanese soldiers, these were strategic footholds, launching points, refueling stations, airfields to be. But what they found were thick jungles, unfamiliar terrain, and a silence that pressed in like damp wool. The local populations had either retreated inland or were forcibly moved. The British had evacuated. The Americans hadn't yet arrived. And in that vacuum of power and presence, the jungle waited. The Japanese quickly established airstrips and float-plane bases, engineering marvels hacked out of raw wilderness. But they never felt in control. Not really. The jungle doesn't yield easily. It creeps back over cleared earth like a memory that refuses to be erased. The heat was oppressive. The insects relentless. The nights darker than anything the mainland had prepared them for. And there were the stories, quiet at first. Laughed off at first. And then not. It was the coast watchers who lit the match. A quiet network of planters, missionaries, and loyal natives, these observers became the eyes and ears of the Allies, hidden in the jungle, sending coded messages about troop movements and fortifications. One of them, never named in the official dispatches, reported something stranger. Not coordinates. Not convoys. But movement. Large, erratic movement in areas untouched by Japanese foot patrols. Entire trees shaking. Figures glimpsed only in silhouette, far larger than any man. At first, the report was dismissed. Tropical illusions. Stress. But then the American invasion of Guadalcanal began, and things escalated. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on the beaches of Guadalcanal. There was little resistance. In fact, the landing was eerily quiet, too quiet. The Japanese had had months to prepare. Reconnaissance photos showed the half-constructed airfield, the entrenched defensive lines. And yet, the defenders were gone. Or rather, they had retreated inland, abandoning the coast with a swiftness that didn't match their usual discipline. Some said it was a tactical decision. Others whispered about the jungle. The Americans advanced quickly at first. They took the airfield, renamed it Henderson Field, and began pushing deeper into the island. But as they moved inland, into thicker growth and higher elevation, they began to notice the same things the Japanese had, signs that something was off. Boot tracks led nowhere. Radios picked up static with no clear source. And then there were the bodies, sometimes dismembered, sometimes simply gone. To understand the scale of this unease, you have to picture the terrain. The Solomon jungles aren't just forests. They're walls. Living, breathing walls of foliage, vine, and stone. The canopy seals out the sun. The humidity is so thick it feels like a second skin. And the soundscape, at first a riot of birds, frogs, and insects, would sometimes stop. All at once. As if something enormous had entered the clearing and everything else held its breath. There were rumors among the Marines, ghost stories traded at night. That Japanese soldiers weren't the only thing hiding in the trees. That some squads never returned not because of snipers or ambushes. But because something had taken them. Something big. Something smart. These weren't new stories. Long before the British came, before maps and names, the local tribes had warned of beings that lived in the high jungles. Giants. Hairy. Cannibalistic. Not animals, not quite human either. Some tribes built tree dwellings to avoid them. Others carved warning symbols into their village entrances. The missionaries had dismissed these legends as pre-Christian superstition. But the islanders never forgot. By 1942, most of the villagers had fled deep into the interiors, farther than even the Japanese had dared go. And in those few, strange encounters with Allied forces, the villagers spoke quietly, urgently, about the giants. They said the Japanese had angered them. Cut down too many trees. Fired too many guns. Dug too deeply. And now, the jungle itself had awoken. Among the few soldiers who survived deeper jungle incursions, the descriptions began to align. Not just shadowy shapes. Not hallucinations. But massive humanoid creatures, 8 to 15 feet tall. Covered in dark fur. Carrying weapons. Moving with coordination. Ambushing, attacking, sometimes dragging bodies away. At first, command didn't believe them. Stress. Delirium. Jungle madness. But when entire patrols vanished, when experienced fighters broke down sobbing and refused to go back inland, something shifted. Not officially. But in the way orders were given. In the way operations quietly avoided certain regions on the map. Because something was wrong in those hills. Something watching. Something ancient. And whatever it wasn't afraid of men with rifles. The Solomon Islands, once a strategic waypoint, had become something else, something haunted. To the Americans, it was a campaign. To the Japanese, a failed occupation. But to the locals, it was a disturbance. A breaking of some unspoken balance between man and myth. That's where our story begins, not with victory or defeat, but with something much harder to define. A vanishing. A silence. A giant footprint left in the mud where no man should have walked. And if the stories are true, if even part of them hold weight, then what happened in the Solomon Islands during those months was not just a battle. It was a trespass. One we may never fully understand. The first reports didn't come in as formal messages. They filtered through the ranks in hushed tones, traded like battlefield currency between men who'd seen too much to dismiss what they felt. At first, they were just murmurs, strange shapes spotted in the distance at dusk, a sensation of being watched even in the thickest fog. But then, the rumors shifted. Grew teeth. Private Matsuda, part of the 229th Infantry Regiment stationed deep within the mountainous interior of Guadalcanal, was one of the first to break silence. His eyes, sunken and bloodshot, betrayed a sleep deprivation far more profound than anything a week of night watches could explain. He hadn't spoken since being recovered by a scout patrol 2 days after he'd gone missing. When he finally did, his voice was quiet, like he was afraid the trees might still be listening. He spoke of something massive. Not an animal, not any soldier. He swore he saw a shape, taller than a transport truck, built like a man but broader, with skin the color of bark and hair like coiled vines. It had eyes, red and wet like raw meat. They glowed, he said, not from any light but from something inside. The thing had crouched behind a ridge at first, watching. Then it stood. And when it moved, it didn't lumber or stomp. It stepped, with the quiet, heavy grace of something that belonged to the jungle. It wasn't until Matsuda described the weapon that the interpreter paused. A club, Head said. Not metal. Not bayonet. Just a club, long, crude, and stone-tipped. He said he heard the sound of something being crushed behind him. When he turned, his partner was already gone. Just blood in the leaves. No scream. No struggle. Just silence. The commanding officer dismissed the account, blaming fatigue and the strain of jungle warfare. Matsuda was removed from duty. But among the ranks, the story took root like mold, quietly and quickly. A week later, a platoon from the 28th Infantry went dark during a recon mission. 6 men. No contact. No gunfire. Not even static on the radio. A second group was sent to investigate and returned short 2 more. The survivors spoke reluctantly. They wouldn't describe what they'd seen, only what they'd heard. One man kept repeating the phrase, "The trees came alive." Another refused to speak at all, eventually transferred back to Japan under a psychological evaluation. But it was what they found at the edge of the ravine that forced officers to take pause, a clearing torn to ruin. Vines shredded like cloth. Trees uprooted, not felled by explosions, but lifted, ripped clean from the earth. Blood, bone, and fragments of Japanese-issued gear scattered across the ground, arranged in no discernible pattern. But not at random either. As if something had moved through the area with intention, not rage. It didn't fit the pattern of American attacks. No spent casings. No blast signatures. No evidence of a firefight. Just absence. And the noise. Always the noise. Corporal Ishikawa described it as a low, oscillating hum, not mechanical, not vocal, but deep enough to make your chest buzz. He said it began just before nightfall and came from the jungle. No clear direction. Like the air itself was groaning. Then the birds stopped. Then the insects. Then came the scream. Not human. Not entirely. Something between a trumpet and a howl, stretched across the canopy like a warning. The sound made men drop their weapons. Some dropped to their knees. One man broke ranks and ran into the trees, never to be seen again. After that night, patrols into the interior changed. Men no longer volunteered. Squad leaders carried their rifles like talismans, not tools. The jungle was no longer just terrain, it was a force. A presence. One lieutenant, newly rotated in from a coastal assignment, tried to rally morale, calling the stories ridiculous. Jungle hallucinations. Trauma-induced superstition. The next morning, he was found 300 meters from his tent, head turned completely around. No footprints. No drag marks. Just his body lying face up, eyes wide, mouth still open like he'd been trying to speak when it happened. His death was marked as enemy action. But no one said the word American. From that point on, the rumors evolved. They weren't just monsters. They were giants. The term filtered in through a whisper chain of radio operators and recovered diaries. Not Bigfoot. Not spirit. Giant. Sometimes with clubs. Sometimes spears. Always territorial. Always violent. Soldiers began to keep tallies on their rations, not to count supplies, but to make sure nothing was being taken. There were nights when their packs had been unfastened. When rations were missing. Not stolen. Rearranged. As if something had been examining them. Learning. Local guides, once paid generously by the Japanese to escort units through the jungle, began refusing assignments. Some wouldn't even enter the interior beyond a certain ridge. When asked why, they would only say, "It is their land. We do not belong there." Even the Korean laborers, overworked and underfed, started disappearing. Not all at once. One or two at a time. The guards reported no gunshots, no escape attempts. Just missing. Gone between dusk and dawn. Then there was the cave. It was stumbled upon during a rerouted march after a torrential storm washed out the usual trail. A forward scout spotted an opening behind a collapsed ridge, a mouth of stone large enough to fit a transport truck. The commanding officer decided to use it as temporary shelter from the storm. They never made it to morning. The soldier who stumbled back to base 3 days later was barefoot, delirious, and missing half of his right ear. He had walked for nearly 20 miles, barefoot, soaked, without stopping. When asked what happened, he only said, "They live in the dark." That night, American listening posts picked up strange transmissions coming from deep within the jungle. Not in code. Not even in Japanese. Just static. And a sound like dragging stone. The incident reports piled up, but command continued to ignore them. War didn't allow for myth. Men disappeared all the time. Delirium was expected. Fear was manageable. But belief? That was dangerous. So they buried the stories. Replaced the rumors with new orders. No more cave patrols. No more inland routes unless explicitly approved. And even then, move fast. No overnight camps. But for the men on the ground, the fear had already settled in. They spoke in low voices around campfires, eyes darting toward the tree lean with every snapped twig or rustle of leaves. They began carving protective symbols into the butts of their rifles. A few even went so far as to tie strips of cloth, torn from local talismans, around their ankles and wrists. Anything to feel protected. Anything to ward off the things the officers pretended didn't exist. As one soldier wrote in a letter that never left the island, "We thought we were invading a stronghold. But the truth is, we're not even the strongest thing here." The jungle was loud in the way a mind becomes loud when left alone in fear, endless chatter of insects, the overlapping chorus of unknown birds, the distant, sudden cry of something unseen. But for the Japanese soldiers retreating deeper into the Solomon Islands, that noise wasn't a comfort. It was a warning. It told them, again and again, that they didn't belong here. After days of losing ground to the American forces, the Japanese squads had been ordered to scatter, avoid direct engagement and regroup in the central interior. That meant slipping away into the dense green hell that was the jungle. The coastlines were lost. The island's edges had been claimed. What remained were the high ridges, the dark valleys, the unexplored silence that locals rarely braved even before the war. Private Shiro Kubo had grown up in the shadow of mountains in rural Japan. He was no stranger to wilderness, to stillness, or to the ways trees could close in on a man. But this jungle was different. It didn't welcome them. It seemed to pulse with an awareness, like it was watching, deciding whether to let them pass or keep them. By the fourth day in the interior, their rations were dwindling. Water became a commodity rationed by discipline and chance, boiled when they could manage a fire, sucked from soaked leaves when they couldn't. Feet blistered. Tempers flared. And something else had settled into their unit, a hum of shared dread. It had started with the tracks. Sergeant Hirota, the most seasoned among them, was the first to notice. Not just animal trails, those were common, but something heavier. Wide impressions in the soil. Bare footprints. Not boots. Not paws. Human-looking, but grotesquely large. As if a giant had passed through recently, with a stride longer than any man's and a weight that pressed deep into the earth. At first, they brushed it off. A trick of erosion. An animal misinterpreted. Something carved out by rainfall. But then they found the tree. It had been split, not snapped like lightning, but torn. The trunk was ripped in two, not cleanly, but violently, as though it had been grabbed and twisted until the fibers could no longer hold. Around it, the underbrush had been crushed in a spiral, heavy, chaotic. Not the neat violence of war. The chaotic rage of something alive. Private Kubo kept those thoughts to himself. The others joked about it. Nervous jokes. Too loud. Too forced. But that night, as they camped in a small clearing between steep jungle walls, the jokes faded. Because something screamed. It wasn't a human voice. Not an animal. It was something in between, a low, guttural sound that rose into a high-pitched wail. It echoed down the ravine, bounced off the stone like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere. Men scrambled for their rifles, fumbling in the dark. A few pulled bayonets free, eyes darting, breaths held like prey. The fire they'd managed to coax to life sputtered out under panicked boots. Shadows rushed in. Nothing came. No movement in the trees. No rustling. Just the jungle, silent again. Panther, someone muttered. It must be a panther. No one corrected him. But the sound haunted them through the night. Over the next few days, the sightings began. Not all at once. Not clearly. But whispers spread from one unit to another, Japanese soldiers who had strayed too far from their group, returning pale-faced, wide-eyed. Some swore they'd seen a creature watching them from the trees. Shaggy. Eyes red like coals. Too large to be real. One soldier, Private Noda, had vanished during a scouting run. His body was found the next morning, crumpled beneath a ridge. Bones shattered. Not from a fall, the sergeant insisted. From impact. As if something had crushed him from above. They buried him quickly. Said little. A few men crossed themselves in the old Christian style, even though they weren't believers. Kubo did too. Just in case. That night, something passed their perimeter. The sentry never saw it. Only heard the low thud of heavy steps and the breath, long, ragged, steaming in the cold night air. When he lit a flare, it was already gone. But the footprints were back. Deeper this time. Closer. By now, rations were gone. Their radios were dead. They were ghosts in enemy land, not hunted by Americans, but by something older. Something that didn't care about flags or uniforms. Something that lived here before any of them. Kubo couldn't sleep. Not just because of the heat or the insects, but because of the noise. Or the lack of it. The jungle had gone quiet. Not once or twice, but regularly. Predictably. Every evening, just after the sun sank and the red light faded, a hush would fall over the trees. No frogs. No birds. Just silence. And in that silence, you could feel it. Breath. Wait. Presence. Then came the trees. It started near Mount Papomanasiu, where the ridge thinned and the trees grew thicker, older. Here, the jungle canopy swallowed the sky completely. No starlight. Just dark. And under that canopy, the trees bore marks, scratches 10 feet up, gouges dug into bark with something sharper than steel. Sap bled like wounds. Sergeant Hirota had stopped walking then. He turned to them, face grim, voice low. "Don't speak their names," he said. The men looked at each other, confused. He continued. "The locals. Before the war. They called them something." "What?" one of the soldiers asked. "Doesn't matter," Hirota said. "Names give power. Just stay alert. Stay in pairs." They didn't argue. Not after what they'd seen. That night, something took Corporal Yasuda. There was no scream. No gunfire. Just a muffled rustle, the sound of cloth sliding over brush, and then nothing. They searched for him with flashlights until dawn. Found a boot. Shredded. Blood. A smear on a rock. No body. Sergeant Hirota didn't allow the men to speak of it. They packed and moved on. But morale was broken. Men began praying aloud at night. Reciting family names. Writing on scraps of paper they tucked into their uniforms. Some whispered of ghosts. Of punishment for the war. Others said nothing, because saying nothing felt safer than being heard. The jungle pressed in tighter. Twice, they heard trees fall. Not snapped by storm, but shoved. Pushed over. The ground shook each time. Birds scattered. The smell of earth and something else, something fetid, like wet animal hide, lingered afterward. Then came the fifth night. The camp was quiet, fire low. The sentry was new, young, fresh from Tokyo. Barely 18. He screamed once. By the time they reached him, he was shaking uncontrollably, unable to form words. His rifle lay a few feet away, untouched. When he finally spoke, he said only this. "It looked at me." "What did?" Hirota asked. I don't know. But it knew me. The next morning, the soldier was gone. No one saw him leave. His gear remained untouched. His boots. His food. Even his canteen, half full. Just gone. That was when Kubo began writing the notes. On the back of maps, torn pages from his rucksack, anything he could find. He wrote what he saw. What he felt. Not because he thought someone would read them, but because he didn't want to forget. Because memory, in that place, was the first thing that began to rot. The last straw came when they reached the ravine. They'd been following what looked like a trail, an old one, possibly made by locals or animals. It led them to a narrow gap between two ridges. And there, at the base, were bones. Hundreds of them. Not all human. Some animal. But many unmistakably were. Skulls. Ribs. Femurs cracked and gnawed. Arranged in patterns. Stacked deliberately. No insects touched them. The air smelled of iron and old rot. Flies buzzed elsewhere. Here, nothing. They turned back. Quiet. Pale. That night, Kubo didn't sleep. He sat with his back to a tree, knife in hand, watching the edges of their camp. That's when he saw it. A shape, tall and narrow, just beyond the firelight. Unmoving. Too still. Eye shine. Dull and yellow. It didn't blink. Didn't move. Just watched. Kubo whispered, not even sure to whom. It's here. But when the others looked, it was gone. The tracks, though, were not. Fresh ones. Pressed deep into the soft jungle floor. Bigger than before. Closer than ever. They didn't sleep again. Because now, they weren't wandering. They were being herded. And whatever was in those jungles, whatever had been watching them from the moment they left the coast, was done waiting. It was coming. And it knew the dark better than they ever would. The jungle didn't whisper secrets, it screamed them. You just had to know how to listen. Nicholas Cox stood at the edge of the overgrown trail in Kolombangara, the thick morning air pressing against his skin like a wet tarp. Somewhere in the distance, a bird with a scream-like call shattered the stillness. It sounded like a woman shrieking and then falling silent, a call that had unnerved even the locals. He had just the shoulder strap of his field pack and leaned forward, squinting at a set of weathered stone steps half buried under vines. They weren't on any map. And they weren't supposed to be here. This wasn't carved by the Japanese, his guide, Kenny, muttered. Too old. This place, nobody comes here. That line again. Nobody comes here. For the past 6 weeks, Cox had been winding his way through remote Solomon Island settlements, interviewing village elders, cross-referencing World War II maps, and following rumors like compass needles pulling towards something primal. What had expected were exaggerated legends. Maybe even outright fabrications. But the deeper he went, the more reluctant the locals became, and the more consistent their stories were. 8-foot-tall men with red eyes. Cannibal tribes. Creatures that uprooted trees and tore men in half like damp paper. And those weren't just wartime ghost stories. They were family memories. Warnings passed down like sacred law. The investigation had officially begun in Honiara, the capital of the Solomon Islands. Cox had landed in the early morning hours, the runway shimmering under the rising sun. His first stop wasn't a historical site or a museum, it was the tiny home of an aging coastwatcher's son. I remember my father's hands more than his face, the man said, fingers curled around a chipped mug of black coffee. They shook when he talked about the jungle. He never feared the Japanese. It was the forest that kept him awake at night. He recounted stories his father had told him, Japanese soldiers abandoning posts, their eyes wide with something deeper than fear. Not retreat. Not combat stress. but a kind of primal unraveling. Men crawling into huts whispering about giants that stalked their patrols. Bodies found mutilated, not with bullets or bayonets, but crushed. Torn. Gnawed. Cox had heard versions of this story before. But what unnerved him was the man's final words. "My father said some of those men weren't killed. They were taken. Whole squads, vanished. Like the jungle swallowed them up." From there, Cox traced his path across the Northern Isles. On each island, he brought only what he could carry: a recorder, a field journal, a satellite phone with a spotty connection, and a waterproof case filled with hand-drawn maps and translated letters from post-war American units. Most of those maps ended in blank space. The interior of the islands, particularly on New Georgia and Malaita, remained largely unexplored even in 2025. Impenetrable terrain, the map said. Hostile vegetation. But Cox knew better. It wasn't the terrain that scared people away. It was what they believed lived within it. In Wwii'S, a tiny port village nestled against the green cliffs of Santa Isabel, Cox met an old woman named Miriam who had once served as a translator for a missionary team in the 1980s. Her hands trembled with age, but her voice carried weight. She didn't flinch when Cox asked about the giants. "They're not gone," she said simply. "They're only sleeping. Some die. Some move. Some watch." She spoke of mountain trails that suddenly vanished. Of strange footprints appearing in the gardens after a night of rain. Of pigs and dogs disappearing without a sound. But more than that, she spoke of the silence. They don't roar like lions. They don't howl like wolves. They stop everything around them. Even the birds. That silence. Cox had felt it only once before, on a reconnaissance trek near Rendova. They had been following an abandoned military trail when the jungle simply muted. No birds. No insects. Even the wind had died. Kenny had frozen mid-step. They turned back without speaking. Cox had dismissed it then. Now, he wasn't so sure. Back in the interior of Kolombangara, Kenny stepped aside as Cox brushed away moss from the stone steps. Beneath the vines, a circular pattern was carved into the stone, concentric rings like ripples frozen in place. He pulled out his notebook. The design didn't match anything Japanese, and it was far older than the war. "This is no base," Cox whispered. "It's ceremonial." The thought made his stomach turn. Had the Japanese stumbled into places like this while retreating from American forces? Into these deep interiors, far from their supply lines and radios? Had they unknowingly trespassed on something sacred? Or worse, something still inhabited? Kenny crouched beside him, scanning the tree line. "You think your people build this?" Cox asked. "My people," Kenny said quietly, "build fences to keep pigs out. Not this." Later that night, they camped by a dry riverbed. The fire crackled low, wrapped in a ring of stones. Smoke curled upward and vanished into the canopy. The jungle was loud, at first. Crickets, frogs, a distant owl. But around midnight, the noise began to vanish. It wasn't sudden. It slipped away in layers. 1 minute, a forest alive with rhythm. The next, nothing. Not quiet. Void. Kenny was already awake. He held a machete across his lap. Cox reached for the satellite phone. No signal. Not even a bar. The air felt thicker now. Weighted. Like something had sucked the oxygen out of it. He didn't know what he was expecting. Footsteps, maybe. A sound of movement. But there was only stillness. And then, just before dawn, they found the tracks. 3 impressions in the mud, each almost as long as Cox's forearm. Deep, clean. Toes splayed slightly outward. Not boot prints. Not animal. Not human. Kenny refused to speak for hours. Back in Honiara, Cox met with a government archivist, one of the few people with access to the island's restricted colonial records. She brought out a folder thick with yellowed paper and brittle photographs. "These are from 1943, she said, military medical reports. Mostly American." She tapped a page and turned it toward him. "Lacerations inconsistent with known weaponry. Abdomen missing. Skeletal damage appears crushing in nature, not fragmentation. Body never recovered." The reports went on. Dozens of them. All vague. All filed under non-combat incidents. And all occurring near jungle regions that locals warned foreigners not to enter. The archivist looked at Cox with tired eyes. They knew something was out there. But they didn't want it in the reports. Just casualties. Not monsters. Cox spent the final days of his investigation on the island of Malaita. It was the most remote, the most difficult to navigate. And according to every local he spoke with, the most sacred. It was here he met a man who called himself Ishmael. Tall. Broad. With a kind of quiet certainty that didn't need exaggeration. "I am descended from the mountain people," he said. "My grandfather told me our blood was mixed with the giants." He didn't mean it metaphorically. Ishmael showed Cox a cave, half-collapsed, moss-covered, and nearly lost to time. "They lived in places like this," he said. "Deep places. Cold places. Places where even the ground listens. Inside the cave were bones. Not ancient. Not staged. Goat bones. Pig bones. And something else. Something that looked longer. Too long." Cox didn't take photos. He just stared. It felt intrusive. Like someone had stepped into a tomb and laughed. "Ishmael," he asked quietly, "do you believe the stories about the Japanese?" The man's eyes didn't waver. They entered where they weren't welcome. Some left. Some didn't. By the time Cox flew back to Australia, he had 2 journals filled with accounts, sketches, maps, and notes. Not one of them proved anything. But none of them felt like lies. Had gone looking for folklore and found consistency. Found reverence. Found fear that didn't age out of a people. Some of the old stories speak of gods. Others of beasts. But the way the Solomon Islander spoke of the giants, it wasn't myth. It was memory. And memories, unlike legends, don't always fade. The jungle does not forget. That was the phrase that kept echoing through Nicholas Cox's thoughts as he unfolded the faded photocopy of the 1943 incident report. Something about it was wrong, not the event itself, but the timestamp. The date was off by nearly 2 weeks compared to every other mission log in the area. And the document had been misfiled, tucked away among naval incident reports from thousands of miles away. It felt deliberate. Like someone had quietly buried it. He ran his fingers along the yellowed paper, reading again. Patrol of 11 Japanese soldiers encountered a hostile presence in the jungle interior. Unit scattered. For return to command post, all exhibiting signs of extreme psychological distress. Interview log states, attacked by red-eyed demons. Smelled like blood and wet stone. Screams did not come from human mouths. No mention of gunfire. No bullet wounds. Just a stench, blood and wet stone, and a cacophony of screams that didn't sound remotely human. But what truly made his breath hitch was the attached photograph. Blurry, black and white, and stained with age. It showed a Japanese soldier clutching what looked like a makeshift club. Not just any club, nearly 6 feet long, notched with crude carvings. Dark stains ran along the shaft. Blood, maybe. Or worse. Behind the soldier, the jungle formed a curtain of shadow. And just at the edge of the frame, something massive and indistinct. A thick leg, perhaps. Or a torso. Whatever it was, it didn't look human. Or animal. It looked like a memory of something primal. Cox leaned back, staring blankly. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. He had been there, those trees, that soil. That area near Mount Makarakambaru. Had stood at the rim of the sinkhole weeks earlier, alone and disoriented, watching mist curl from the mouth of the void like breath from something alive. The locals had begged him not to go. They said the birds didn't sing there. That nothing grew right. That the wind stopped moving once you got too close. Back then, Head brushed it off as superstition. But he remembered now, clear as day, the strange silence, the way his radio fuzzed with static for the first time in weeks, the chill that had crept up his back as if something had noticed him. The depression wasn't just a sinkhole. It was a gateway, an ancient entrance to something vast, something hollowed beneath the earth. He hadn't known then that soldiers had vanished there. No wreckage. No sounds of battle. They just ceased. But it was the claw marks along the rock that had stayed with him. Long gashes, three-pronged, dragged into stone like fingernails into flesh. Not made by tools. Not weather. These weren't the remnants of collapse. These were signs of emergence. Something had climbed out. And now, clutching that photo, Cox felt the world shift under his feet. The cave systems dotting the island weren't just remnants of geological time. They were habitats. Dens. Lairs. And some, he feared, were not abandoned. He remembered another conversation, back on Malaita. An old man named Atoro, draped in worn linen, had spoken through a trembling translator. His voice was cracked like dry bark but filled with purpose. "You're looking for what should not be found," Atoro said. Atoro spoke of the old blood, of beings that had never been men, yet walked like them. He said they were watchers. Listeners. Buried beneath the land but not sleeping. Atoro claimed the war had woken them. The Japanese, Atoro spat, they made too much noise. Too many guns. They stayed where we never go. They made the jungle angry. Nicholas had assumed, back then, that this was just island myth. Folklore woven into the trauma of war. But something about the old man's eyes, the absence of fear, replaced by grim certainty, told a deeper truth. Atoro didn't believe. He remembered. On a dusty hotel floor in Honiara, Nicholas laid out his findings. Dozens of documents, maps, and photographs. Patterns emerged, sightings clustered around cave systems, sinkholes, collapsed tunnels, areas previously thought unreachable. All correlated with sudden troop disappearances. One report from an American Marine described red eyes blinking in the canopy at night. Another claimed their patrol had heard what sounded like stone scraping stone. One soldier swore he heard whispers underground, whispers in a language he didn't recognize but couldn't forget. Nicholas remembered something else then. Something quiet. In a village not far from the western coast, a woman named Mara had handed him a bundle wrapped in faded palm leaves. Inside was a charm, woven from old rope and bone. She called it a remembrance. When asked what it was for, she had simply replied, "To keep them from following you back." He had laughed. But now, in that dimly lit room, with war documents and tales of giants spread before him, he understood, she hadn't meant spiritually. She meant literally. One note, nearly lost among the clutter, came from a Royal Australian Navy operative in 1945. The man had interviewed 3 Japanese prisoners after the Guadalcanal campaign. All 3 had refused to speak about the war. But when questioned about the jungle, one had whispered, "Yama no Kami, the god of the mountain." When asked what that meant, he replied, "It watches." The operative had thought the man insane. Nicholas no longer did. The twisted detail. Yama no Kami wasn't just some vague Japanese myth. It was an actual forest spirit in Shinto belief, capable of punishing humans who disturbed the balance of the land. What if the phrase wasn't metaphor? What if it was accurate? He flipped the last document over and paused. Handwritten in pencil, barely legible, was a line scribbled by a junior intelligence officer. "Whatever's out there. It's not finished with us." Nicholas closed the folder. Outside, the jungle wind stirred like breath on the back of his neck. And in that moment, he wasn't sure what terrified him more. That the stories were true. Or that the world had moved on. While something below had not. The jungle is patient. It doesn't offer up its secrets easily. But for those who know how to look, who know when to listen and when to wait, it sometimes grants glimpses into the stories buried beneath vines and silence. What happened in the Solomon Islands during World War II wasn't just a clash of nations. It may have been something older. A confrontation between the modern world and something ancient, something primal. To understand it, we have to piece together what we can from fragments, military records, local oral histories, obscure archaeological observations, and first-hand accounts passed down in whispers. What emerges is not a clear picture, but a shadow, a reconstruction that blurs the line between documented warfare and something far stranger. Start with what we know. By the time American troops landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, Japanese forces had already begun retreating inward, away from the beaches. That itself wasn't surprising, standard guerrilla strategy. What wasn't standard were the reports that followed. First came the absences. Entire squads disappearing into the jungle without a trace. No gunfire. No bodies. Just men who went in and never came out. Then the stories. Whispers among Japanese survivors told of hulking figures moving through the canopy. Massive silhouettes watching from the treetops or just behind the curtain of foliage. Sounds that didn't match any known wildlife, deep bellowing roars and high-pitched wails, followed by silence so complete it pressed against the eardrums. Terrified soldiers described being stalked, not just by an enemy force, but by something that didn't move like a man. Something that could lift boulders and uproot trees. Some reports said they carried weapons, massive stone clubs, primitive spears. Others said they needed nothing but their hands. One tale, repeated by two different survivors years later, described a soldier being pulled screaming into the trees during night watch. Another described an entire company falling back after hearing what they believed was a battle cry followed by the distinct snapping of thick trunks. Skeptics chalked it up to exhaustion, dehydration, mass hysteria in the brutal conditions. But the stories weren't coming from just one place. They were echoed, slightly altered, in reports from several locations, Malaita, Guadalcanal, and even smaller islands with no formal combat presence. That's where the local knowledge comes in. The islanders didn't treat the stories as myth. They treated them as fact. The red-eyed giants, the forest-dwelling beings who walked like men but lived like predators, were not new inventions. The elders had spoken of them for generations. In some stories, they were protectors. In others, they were brutal and cannibalistic. Almost always, they were territorial. You didn't go into the deep jungle without leaving offerings. You didn't light fires near the wrong caves. And above all, you didn't stay overnight. The connection becomes more chilling when you begin to thread timelines together. Oral histories from several villages mention a sudden spike in disappearances around 1942 to 1943. Not of islanders, but of strangers. Outsiders. Japanese soldiers, mostly. Many locals believe the giants viewed the war as an invasion. Not by one nation over another, but by humanity itself. A trespass into a part of the world that had long resisted civilization. So what if the giants didn't start the fight, but responded to it? There's a possible chain of events, speculative but consistent with the data. First, the Japanese forces begin their inland retreat, digging into more isolated regions. They establish temporary bases, dig tunnels, chop trees, and disturb land that had gone untouched for centuries. Second, the initial encounters, likely scouts or patrols, stumble into giant territory. The giants, interpreting this as a threat, respond. The first responses are likely warnings. Displays of strength. Uprooted trees. Roars. But soldiers don't heed these warnings. They can't afford to. Third, retaliation escalates. The attacks turn brutal. Men disappear. Reports get passed up the chain, but what commander is going to report giant attacks to Tokyo? The Japanese High Command assumes it's guerrilla warfare. They push harder. More incursions. Fourth, the fear spreads among the troops. Not fear of Americans, but of something else in the jungle. Morale plummets. Some soldiers begin deserting, not to surrender, but to escape. They flee not towards safety, but away from the trees. Fifth, American forces begin encountering panicked, starving soldiers in the jungle. Some are raving. Some are silent. All of them are broken in ways that don't align with battle trauma alone. Some won't sleep. Others wake up screaming about red eyes in the dark or men with no language who scream like animals. From here, the lines blur. One American field report describes coming across a clearing where it looked like a massive skirmish had taken place, but no shell casings were found. Only blood. And drag marks. In another, a bulldozer crew at a gold mine discovered 3-foot-long footprints near a shattered piece of equipment they'd left behind overnight. The cumulative evidence doesn't confirm anything, but it does align. Different sources, military, civilian, anthropological, seem to orbit the same dark gravity well. Each report adds another contour to the shape. And then there are the tunnels. Japanese defensive structures were known to be elaborate, often involving cave systems and hidden bunkers. But in at least 3 sites, Allied demolition crews discovered passageways that extended far deeper than expected. Not wide enough for modern machinery. Dug with something else. Tools, perhaps, but not modern ones. Some theorists believe these tunnels were not Japanese at all, but older. Possibly ancient. And that the Japanese, without knowing, built on top of a network already in place. This brings us to the broader mystery, were the giants not just defenders of a territory, but of something older still? Some locals claim that the jungle interior holds entrances to a different world. Not metaphorically, but literally. Cave systems that descend into darkness, farther than anyone has dared explore. In these caves, the giants are said to live, hidden from the surface. Only emerging when provoked. And in 1942, they were provoked. Now, in reconstructing these events, we must make room for the idea that the conflict in the Solomon Islands wasn't just about military strategy. It was a cultural and environmental collision. A clash between 3 worlds, the modern, the ancestral, and the unknown. What we're left with is not certainty. It's not proof. It's pattern. Too many stories align. Too many voices echo similar things, separated by decades and miles of ocean. The giants are not ghosts. They are remembered. And memory, especially in places where history was oral long before it was written, carries a different kind of truth. So, what happened in those jungles? Perhaps it was madness born of stress and sleep deprivation. Perhaps it was folklore, given shape by fear. Or perhaps it was something real. A hidden species. A remnant from a time before men carved borders into islands. Something that survived, not just by hiding, but by enforcing its silence with violence. And when war came knocking at its door, it knocked back. The stories were outrageous. Giants ripping trees from the ground, devouring soldiers alive, women returning decades later claiming to have birthed children by jungle-dwelling monsters. If you stack them one atop the other, they begin to feel like folklore, impossibly vivid, disturbingly primal, and yet somehow unshakable. It's at this point in the tale, just when the mystery seems airtight and the connections oddly coherent, that the seams start to split. Because for every whispered account of a giant footfall, there is a void where actual documentation should be. For every account of a Japanese soldier torn limb from limb, there is an absence of names, dates, or official reports. And then there's the field archaeologist Nicholas Cox himself, who, after immersing himself in the stories, began to question everything. He admitted it plainly, in his later reflections. The deeper he waded into the mythos, the more difficult it became to discern whether he was uncovering forgotten truths, or being absorbed into a cultural mirage. It wasn't that the locals were lying. Far from it. Their sincerity was palpable, unwavering. That's what made it all the more unsettling. When he asked if the giants were real, their answers came as casually as someone confirming tomorrow's sunrise. Yes. Of course. Everyone knew that. But belief, as Nicholas learned, is not evidence. And so he turned back toward the tangible, the bones, the rusted helmets, the remnants of war left to rot beneath the Solomon sun. And in that tangle of earth and decay, something gnawed at him. Not the lack of physical proof of the giants, but the patterns of absence themselves. Why were the Japanese forces so eerily unprepared on Guadalcanal, when every military analysis suggested they should have mounted a fierce defense? Why were their entire swaths of jungle considered unpassable, even by locals, long after the war had ended? Why had stories about encounters with man-eating giants been told with such consistency across separate island groups? Still, skepticism crept in. The accounts were too clean. Too archetypal. Women stolen and returned. Warriors eaten alive. Children sired by monsters. The same motifs seen in ancient epics and colonial explorer diaries alike. It echoed mythologies from places far removed from the Pacific, tales of Nephilim, of wild men, of beings too large and too ancient to belong to the present. Was this an echo of human psychology rather than human history? Even Mango's story, the woman said to have disappeared for 25 years, only to return wild-eyed and pregnant by a giant, left gaping questions. There were no photographs. No medical records. Just retellings passed mouth to mouth like sacred folklore. And yet, locals still spoke of her burial site. As if it were not a metaphor, but a place you could walk to. A patch of dirt with bones beneath. Doubt began to swell, not as denial, but as something worse, the collapse of clarity. Because doubt doesn't destroy belief, it corrodes it. Slowly. Like salt water against steel. Nicholas found himself returning to the same internal dilemma. If there was nothing real in these stories, then how could so many people speak of them with such certainty? Why would elders pass them down, detail by detail, if they were false? Could it be that over time, the truth had mutated, dressed up in superstition and ritual until even the tellers no longer knew what they were remembering? He considered the anthropological reports from the early 1900s. German researchers describing the Kakamora as if they were just another wild species, like a jungle pig or bird of paradise. They didn't speak of them as monsters. They catalogued their diets, their tools, their nesting behavior. It read more like a field guide than a ghost story. And that presented a new problem. If these Kakamora were real, and smaller, more human-like than the giants, could they have been misinterpreted? Perhaps it wasn't that Japanese soldiers saw 15-foot titans, but that they encountered something uncanny. Something near human. And in the fever of war, exhaustion, and fear, their minds filled in the rest. The jungle does things to a person. The heat, the noise, the endless green, it distorts time, memory, even shape. There's a saying among intelligence officers, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. But that doesn't mean you ignore the silence. And the Solomon Islands had plenty of it. Silence around official reports. Silence from Japanese historians. Silence, even now, from modern anthropology. Nicholas had tried, truly, to find Japanese veterans who might have spoken of these encounters. But they were all gone. The few who might have seen something had died, their stories buried with them, or else diluted through decades of denial. And with Japan's deeply embedded code of shame and honor in defeat, who would have dared to admit they'd been terrified not just of the enemy, but of something unknown, something inhuman? Then came the issue of scale. The giants were said to be 15 feet tall. That alone raised biological red flags. No modern human, or known hominid, could reach such proportions without suffering catastrophic bone density and cardiovascular failure. Unless they were built differently. Unless the stories exaggerated over time. But even then, 8 or 9 feet. Where were the bones? The burial sites? The middens of their camps? A creature that large would leave massive footprints, yes, but also hair, scat, signs of habitation. There were none. And so the questions circled back on themselves, like vines strangling the same broken tree. The stories made sense, emotionally, narratively. But scientifically, they fell apart on touch. They were ghost fragile. Yet still, the jungle stood. Unmapped. Unyielding. Still, the villagers wouldn't cross certain trails. Still, the mining crews refused to work after sundown. And Nicholas? He found himself standing on the edge of one such jungle clearing, his boots sunk into the leaf rot, heart pounding, not because of what he knew, but because of what he could no longer dismiss. There is something worse than being lied to. It is not knowing which parts of the story were true. And that is where the Solomon Islands left him, not with answers, but with fractures. A mind split between wonder and disbelief. A mystery that never declared itself outright, only whispered, half in myth, half in memory. And sometimes, that's all you get. A question. With teeth. There's a particular stillness to the Solomon Islands, especially at dusk. The sun bleeds out in streaks of red and gold across the jungle canopy, and the cicadas begin their mechanical chorus. The air becomes thick with memory, stories clinging to the humidity like mist. And if you stand quiet enough, if you allow yourself to really listen, you might just feel it. That ghost pressure. That low hum of something ancient, watching. That's what stays with you long after the facts dissolve, after the names blur, and the details get traded back and forth across time like stones in a pocket. What remains is a feeling. A presence. A sense that the jungle is not empty, and never was. We came looking for history. For footprints. For something that could be measured, catalogued, written down in the margins of official reports. But what we found, what we always seem to find in stories like these, is a threshold. A fogged mirror. One half myth, one half memory. And no matter how long we stare into it, it doesn't blink first. Somewhere between the mangled bones of a forgotten outpost and the whispered stories of giants tearing men from their posts in the dead of night, lies a deeper truth. Not about what is real, but about what matters. That humanity has always lived beside the unknown. Sometimes it's the howling from the forest line. Sometimes it's the ache in your bones when you know something's wrong, even if you can't explain it. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's the jungle that looks back. We've heard stories from Vietnam. From Afghanistan. From the Arctic. From deep American forests and abandoned Siberian stations. Always the same pattern. Isolation. Tension. A war-touched edge. Then something breaks through the veil, something that doesn't fit. Something that isn't supposed to be there. So maybe it was never about just the Solomon Islands. Maybe this place is just one open wound in a world that's riddled with them. Places where the walls between what we understand and what we fear wear thin. Where stories grow teeth. And yet, we return. Again and again. To the stories. To the half-believed memories passed down from elders, written into footnotes, whispered between patrols. Not because we want answers, but because we want permission to wonder. Because it means that maybe the world is still wilder than we gave it credit for. It's not the monsters that stay with you. Not really. It's the silence that follows them. Nicholas Cox, when asked years later whether he believed in the giants, didn't offer a yes or no. He said, "I believe in how deeply people believe. And that's something you can't excavate with a shovel." Maybe that's enough. We didn't find proof in the end. No skeletons, no photographic evidence, no irrefutable DNA. But we found fear. We found awe. We found generations of people whose stories hadn't changed for centuries. Whose warnings weren't metaphors, but memories. That has to count for something. Because what if belief, raw, unadorned belief, is the last uncharted terrain? What if these legends don't survive because they're true, but because they're useful? Warnings. Moral scaffolds. Cultural scar tissue. Or maybe they survive because, deep down, we all know that the edges of the map still aren't safe. That something waits in the dark, indifferent and ancient and real in ways our science can't yet measure. Maybe one day, someone will discover bones too big to ignore. Or find a cave still warm from breath. But until then, we're left with stories. And stories, when told well, are more than placeholders for truth. Sometimes, they're the only truth we have left. So, if you ever find yourself walking the jungle path at twilight, and the shadows lengthen, and the wind dies, and the forest leans in just a little too close, ask yourself this. Do you really want to know what's out there? Or are you simply hoping it doesn't notice you first? The jungle never gives back what it takes. That's the last sentence Nicholas Cox wrote in the margins of his notebook during his final days on the Solomon Islands. He never intended for it to be the closing line. But sometimes, truth doesn't need permission to end a story. Even now, decades after the Americans left the beaches, the Japanese faded into the mist, and the gold mining operation stalled in bureaucratic rust, something remains. Something deeply embedded in the soil, the trees. The caves. Something untouched by maps and military reports. Unwritten by history books. And unsolved. The question isn't whether the stories are true. It's whether the truth even matters anymore. Because every piece of this puzzle, every whispered account of red-eyed giants and half-human creatures, every mutilated body spoken of in hushed tones, leads to a crossroads. You either believe that the men who ran screaming from the bush were cracked open by war. Or by something the war couldn't name. In the years since, teams have returned. Anthropologists. Cryptid hunters. Journalists. Some leave with trinkets and photographs. Others leave with nothing but silence. None have stayed long. The locals always give the same warning, don't go inland after dark. And if you hear singing, don't answer it. It's a strange kind of certainty they carry. The way fishermen talk about tides, or elders speak of storms. Not superstition. Experience. But experience doesn't write reports. And experience doesn't satisfy governments or skeptics. So the records remain incomplete. The giants, if they ever truly walked here, leave no footprints the world is willing to see. Then again, maybe they were never meant to. Maybe the point isn't to prove them. Maybe the point is that they don't want to be known. That something so ancient, so brutal and woven into the mythology of this land, resists exposure like a wound recoils from salt. Even the so-called evidence that does exist, a bulldozer blade hurled 100 meters through dense undergrowth, footprints as wide as dinner plates, oral history spanning centuries, all of it drifts in and out of credibility. Like mirages. Like stories told too many times to be trusted, and too often to be dismissed. And that's the paradox of the Solomon Islands mystery. It isn't a closed file. It's a door left slightly ajar. The final sightings, if you believe the scattered reports, paint a picture both terrifying and quiet. A lone woman vanishing for decades, returning with a blank stare and a child that didn't survive. Miners quitting en masse after seeing something near the tree line. Government agents politely refusing to comment on questions that no one officially asked. And then, nothing. No conclusive proof. No final confrontation. No skeletal remains preserved in amber or tucked away in some secret museum basement. Just stories. Hundreds of them. Echoing across generations like war drums through the canopy. The truth is, some questions don't want answers. Some questions are meant to keep us looking. So we ask, what was it that drove entire units of armed men into panicked retreats, long before the first American bullet ever found its mark? What made seasoned soldiers claw at each other just to get out of the jungle? And why do those who live to tell about it refuse to talk about it in anything but riddles and metaphors? Whatever it was enough. Enough to silence. Enough to scatter. Enough to seed a myth that not only survived the war, but grew stronger in its shadow. And now, all we have are echoes. The sounds of something enormous brushing through the high canopies. The gut-deep sense that you are not alone out there. That the world is not as empty as we pretend. That something watches. So we leave it here. Not with a period, but with a question mark. The jungle still stands. The stories still breathe. And somewhere, maybe just past the bend in that forgotten trail, or deep beneath the limestone hills of Maleta, a giant still waits. Whether it waits to be found, or to be forgotten, no one can say.